what do you? I know you said in some of your written material that you don't intend for data centers to be everything that you write about. It's just absorbing a lot
Yeah,
of your time at the moment. So
there's a lot
maybe
to say. Yeah.
tell us what do you spend most of your time on, or what would you aspirationally like to spend most of your time on?
Yeah, data centers and like it is pretty overwhelming just how much there's left to say and just how much the public debate seems to be really wildly off still about the general data center situation, even just like tax revenue, the situation with electricity prices. I still haven't actually written a big piece about like how I think about like data centers and climate change specifically, and like those do weigh on me because like almost every day I'll still go out in DC and meet educated people who like confidently say things like, oh, data centers raise electricity prices by like 200%. And I'm like, oh, that comes from this one, thing that's not correct. And like, there's still a lot to say to try to push the conversation. And so I still end up with a lot of my day-to-day time going to data center stuff. I think beyond that, I definitely want to write a lot more about other like big kind of like philosophical ideas or like ideas in like economics and politics that have been pretty important to me, or just like maybe even just explore other industries a little bit. There's just a lot that's going like unarticulated, I think, that like I really enjoy writing about. Like, I was a philosophy major in undergrad and have kind of just wanted to do a few deep dives on like philosophers that I like that I think get like less attention in the mainstream than they should. And then obviously there's a lot to say about AI. Like there's I think like the main interesting thing about AI is not actually how much water it uses, obviously. And so like I think I can add less to the conversation there. There's just like a lot of great writing happening on AI from all different sides right now. And so like on that one
Yeah,
specifically, yeah, I'm feeling less urgency, but definitely want to like take a stab at like some of the big questions.
yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating because today I opened up the journal and there are actually three articles on on data centers. There's one on how they're filling up all the commercial cargo flights. The other is data center operators selling out majority stakes at pretty large premiums. And then there's one about a couple who managed to sell out land at $330,000 an acre for a data center, which obviously paid better than the hog farm that they were historically running in that space. So it's fascinating. Like, one day, three articles about data centers, and so it's clearly occupying. And I noticed in the comments section here, we have some comments about how public sentiment ever get better. And there was one suggestion, I think, in the journal, which is, well, maybe architecturally we ought to make these data centers look a little more presentable so that they don't just look like big chunks of concrete and exhaust stacks. What do you think about that?
I think a huge amount of the public sentiment, I think, is actually coming from confused reporting rather than people's actual on the ground experience of data centers. Like, living in DC, I find that like very few people around me have actually like driven out to Loudoun County where there are a lot of data centers, and they have very strong opinions about them without ever having like experienced one or experienced the effects of one specifically. And like usually I find that like when people talk to me, say about like data centers using all the land, like my first question is like, have you ever seen a data center? And like the majority of people will say no specifically. And I do worry that like in trying to trace like where did this public sentiment come from, I think so much of it is coming from like a few years where almost every major story the average educated person read about where basically there are these buildings just plopping in people's communities and basically destroying them. They're ruining the water, they're ruining the air and things like that. And they're all being used for this far off thing called AI that like maybe is useful, maybe is a scam. It's associated with like tech oligarchs who like people justifiably are more distrustful of. And like I think personally, like so little of changing public sentiment is actually going to come from changing how data centers behave. And it's much more just like getting people an understanding of how that behavior is contextualized in the broader situation. I guess like I just have talked to a lot of city planners at this point, and I've talked to people who have talked to a lot of city planners, and it's like pretty overwhelming how positive the experience of like city government people is with data centers specifically. And if data centers could actually pull levers to change things, you would assume that there would be more complaints on the ground from people who are actually thinking about this stuff a lot. But like I have to say, like I feel like this sounds very uncharitable to a lot of like data center critics, but like it's become really hard for me after about a year of this to come away thinking that like this is mainly emanating from what data center companies themselves are doing. Like there are a few extreme edge cases where, you know, construction was bad, or like obviously like Elon's data centers are their own special case, but like outside of those specifically, like I'm really worried that the public sentiment isn't actually coming from what data centers are doing. And so I'd be down to make them look better. Like the facades like obviously look really ugly a lot of the time, but like again, there are a lot of other ugly buildings that people seem totally fine with. And so like I suspect that that's not the main reason why this is happening.
I mean, it's hard to get too worked up about the aesthetics of a data center that sits in, for example, West Texas. You know, because what else is there to look at? But I do tend to think that there is a huge bandwagon effect that's going on in the press. That, you know, when we're talking about what it is that can mobilize people's attention most, it's sort of fear and anger, and the fear and anger axis for journalists is a very strong one. And politicians are not ignorant of the potential for that bandwagon to help them out. You know, people showing up with cans of dirty water at congressional hearings and saying, the water was never like this before the data center showed up. Isn't it awful? And then people showing up saying, yeah, the government should take stakes in AI companies. The benefits of them should be distributed. We need to get ahead of this. And before it wrecks us all. And people are like, yeah, these tech bros are just, you know, they're just running amok with their own little power trip. And it's not going to benefit us at all. So I think maybe it's worth thinking a bit about how data centers might be aligned with a more sort of social equality and widespread access that and some of the benefits that could generate, because it is a little mind-boggling when you think about a data center that could take up an area greater than Central Park, right? So Central Park's maybe 800 acres. That's not even a 1 gigawatt data center footprint. You know, there's an extraordinary sort of breadth of how do you visualize that footprint in terms of land. And so people are like, well, if it's that big, if it's that hard to comprehend, it must be bad, right? Everything's out of control. AI is out of control. But then when you think through, what is AI actually offering to people, you know, to potentially kids who don't have access to tutors because their parents can't afford it, but now they can have personalized AI tutor. And then what does it take to provide that? Well, you have to crunch the data somewhere. And that somewhere is inevitably the data center. So you need these tools to deliver that. What do you think about that? I haven't read too many stories about the sort of equalizing force of AI and then recognizing the sort of back-end reality of that.
Yeah, I tend to say, I feel like I always want to flag here that I do consider myself to be like kind of an expert on like data centers in general, but like the general effect of AI on all society, you know, I'm kind of just some guy there. I will say that there's like obviously a lot of reasons to be worried about AI. Like I don't want to say that there are no risks, you know, I'm like pretty associated with the effective altruist professional network in general. And like, we're all pretty worried about like edge cases where things could get really crazy. But I have to also say that like the models as they exist right now, I'm just so envious of people in college, especially because like I would have just like, I don't know, in undergrad, I was a double major in philosophy and physics, and there were just so many like questions or things that just weren't clearly articulated, or things that I couldn't quite approach like the core idea of, especially in philosophy actually. And when I would try to reach out to, you know, specific books or like professors, I would often get kind of like mangled, like half explanations that weren't quite up to par. And like, I have to say, like using the models now, like my life would have been so easier, and I could have accessed like so many more ideas that way, with like the like caveat that like I don't actually know. I like to think I would have been ethical enough to never use AI to cheat in college, but like, you know, it seems like most college students also are. So there's a question of that as well. It has been like pretty shocking how little reporting has talked about all the like really obvious upsides of like the models as they exist. And like I personally just wouldn't have been able to do a lot of what I'm doing without them. Like I obviously like don't rely on their like as rely on them as a source of absolute truth. Like I check all their links and stuff, but like even just having this like super search to be able to like find like, oh hey, like does this data center like plug into the municipal water system? It'll be like, oh here Andy, on page 352 of this town document from 2019, I found this note about how it's going to plug into the municipal water system. And like I don't have to rely on it. I can check page 352, but if it's actually there, like that alone is just such a huge upgrade for me from the past. And so like yeah, I do know just like so many people who have been benefited by the models, and not super like techie people who are otherwise prone to like boost AI or boost like tech specifically. So like I feel pretty decently about its effects on just like everyday people having access to information. And then like on the equity thing, like I think a lot of the data center conversation, the conversation about the physical infrastructure is ignoring the just the need for a lot more tax revenue in a lot of like low income areas, with the caveats that if the externalities of the data center are too bad, that definitely doesn't justify like certain levels of tax revenue. But like, I don't know, there was a recent data center ban pretty close to where I grew up in Massachusetts, where a town that I just know is pretty poor and just gets a ton of its tax revenue from either like a mall or like a local like marijuana growing industry that just isn't doing super well right now. Like there's just not too much going on, and a lot of the town's pretty poor. And basically like the data centers seem to have been banned for reasons that I don't really think add up personally. And like in that case, like this town that could have really used the tax revenue really missed out. And so even on like the question of physical infrastructure, I think there are a lot of just like questions about equity that aren't really being asked, or are basically being asked in a one-sided way, if that makes sense.
I know you've dug into the tax revenue discussion quite a bit. So maybe spend a few minutes laying out how the tax revenue model from a data center perspective delivers revenues to the municipality.
Yeah, so there are different aspects of the data center that can be taxed, and different things that can be exempted as well. Like basically the equipment inside of the data centers is just very expensive. And then you can also tax the land and things like that. And so if you're applying a tax even just on the equipment and the land, and you also include like the utility revenue specifically, these three things on their own can lead to just a huge amount of tax revenue pouring into a community relative to the resources that data centers use. Like, again, like I like to use Loudoun as an example, just because it's an extreme outlier of like what a lot of other communities could look like if they built a huge number of data centers, because it has the most data center capacity of any county in the country. And like right now, something like 3% of its land is going to data centers, and something like 10% of the water that it withdraws goes to data centers. And in return, like the data centers are supplying something like $1.3 billion every year in tax revenue. It's like something like half of the county's total tax base. Person in Loudoun is paying a few $1,000s less every year in property taxes. And they're also going to fund the local school system and stuff like that. And here, like, I really worry that while there are definitely externalities, like the conversation about tax revenue is often like, oh, the tax revenue is this kind of like far off, ambiguous thing that doesn't really make it into the conversation about whether data centers are good or bad. Whereas in fact, I think it should be pretty central, because like the decision to not build a data center is effectively the decision to like go without this amount of tax revenue for the sake of offsetting the externalities that it brings. And so like the general question I have is that like, like data centers can be exempted from certain types of taxes. Like there are certain types of sales taxes that most counties and states have exempted data centers from. But if you add up all the other types of taxes, just like the specific ways that we can tax the very expensive equipment inside, or other things that have, or like the cost of construction and things like that. If you add all those up and just ask like, separate from what specifically is being taxed in the data center, like if you just look at the totals and the total amount of revenue that they're raising, like, is this total revenue worth it to impose the externalities, or would it be worth it to spend this much revenue to avoid the externalities? And like, that's usually where I'd like the debate to be. And like, obviously there are some extreme outliers where I think data centers shouldn't have been built, even though they do bring in tax revenue. But I think that like for the average data center, like I think if the average citizen were just like blindfolded and didn't know that we were talking about a data center and was like, here are all the upsides and all the downsides, like they would usually choose the tax revenue over like saving like 5% of the county's water or something like that.
So you think it's really the naming and the narrative that's attached to data centers at the moment that is driving the reaction rather than an objective assessment of what the costs are measured across a number of different variables: water, electricity, land use, what the revenue implications are measured against those things, and then a rational determination of whether it's a net positive to the community.
Yeah. And I will say that there are some extreme cases. So, like the example that I just talked about in Massachusetts would have been built inside of an old decaying industrial building that wouldn't, I don't even know that it would have probably looked better than how it did specifically. But I do want to say that there are also a lot of other hard to price objections to data centers that I definitely know people who have talked to people in different counties, and they're opposing this very large new structure that's going to exist in this otherwise very pristine field somewhere. And they'll say, "Oh, I'm mad about the water." And the person talking to them will be like, "Oh, what is the amount of water that the data center could use where you would be okay with it? Like if we were able to drop its cost to a certain amount, what's the acceptable amount of water?" And after a lot of back and forth, a lot of people will kind of put their cards down and say, the more I think about it, I'm actually not really super invested in the specific amounts of water. I kind of just don't want my region to change. I kind of just don't want things to look different. And I think this is a more human and understandable thing that I don't really have a clear oh, you should trade off your beautiful view against this much tax revenue. I don't think there's a final answer there. And so it's kind of a case by case thing. I think that there's both a lot of I think very confused objections to data centers, in Holyoke, the Massachusetts town I'm talking about. A lot of the objections seem to come from the idea that the data center would quote unquote pollute the water, even though I'm pretty convinced this mostly doesn't happen as a serious problem. We can talk about the specifics there if people are interested. But in other cases where it is going to meaningfully change just your view, or just other aspects, there might be if you drive over here, you might hear more of a hum or something like that. These are much harder to price externalities, and I think people's quote unquote rational desires have to obviously be taken into account in a democratic way. I don't totally know how to add those up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments from Sanjay is asking about that hum. The health effects from data centers humming, which I suppose is somewhat analogous to the presumed deleterious effect of the sound of wind turbines that drive people crazy, whatever, drive cattle crazy, drive down property values. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a ton to say about that. So there are basically two different types of noise pollution. One I take very seriously, and one I think is completely fake, basically. So I'm pretty worried about audible noise pollution. I think that this is actually a significant problem with data centers, where a lot of situations have happened where a data center will be built relatively close to people's homes, and the data center company will assume that they won't make any noise at all because they're going to be plugged into the grid, and they won't have to on on-site gas turbines that might be very noisy specifically. But then something happens with the local utility where, say, because the utility is just racing to get other data centers online as well, they'll be like, "Oh, hey, we don't have the time to connect you to the grid yet. We need 6 months or something." And in the meantime, the data center has invested all this money in being built and operating, and it's going to lose out on huge amounts of revenue if it doesn't begin operating ASAP. And so it has a very strong incentive to bring on-site gas turbines or other things that make a lot of noise specifically. And once those are there, noise in general is just regulated in a worse way than I expected when I first started reading about this issue in America. I think that, where I live in Washington, D.C., I'm definitely exposed to my own versions of noise pollution. There are, really loud cars sometimes, or my neighbor's dogs are kind of going really crazy right now. But I have to say that those types of noise pollution aren't nearly as disturbing to me as the idea of a constant low level hum that I can hear. I think if I had to live with that for a year, basically go mildly crazy. That just seems pretty upsetting. And there are also extreme cases where very poorly planned, I think there was one data center that was mainly focused on Bitcoin mining in Texas that really harmed a lot of people very close to where it was, because it was just creating unbelievable amounts of noise that was kind of just below the threshold that the county could regulate. And so that specifically I do really worry about. And I do think that data centers do pose a meaningful challenge. Like there are ways to fix it, but like that's something I take seriously. The thing that I don't take seriously that's become pretty popular is the separate idea that you had mentioned of infrasound specifically, which is kind of like infrared light, where it's noise that's at a wavelength that's too low for us to audibly hear. And the claim is that even though we can't audibly hear it, it can still affect us in all these ways. There's a really popular YouTube video from Ben Jordan on this. It's one of the most popular pieces of media on data centers this year specifically, where he drives around and talks about all these like harms of infrasound. He like measures infrasound coming out of data centers and stuff like that. He does like kind of his own like test to see how people react to infrasound. And it also is very like professional and chill. Like he seems like a neat guy. And if you actually look at the studies that he's flashing on the screen, I have a very long post going into the details here. But basically every single study that he flashes on the screen, he misrepresents. Like there may be a few that he gets basically right, but almost all of them, he'll be like, oh, here are all these negative effects of infrasound. And he flashes the study on the screen with these like little highlights. And like, if you go and investigate the study is about the harms of audible noise pollution, not about infrasound. And it'll like clearly say that. And this happens like over and over again. And like, I'm definitely open to the possibility that like, yeah, maybe in like extreme weird situations, infrasound can have some negative health effects. But one, I don't think that data centers are producing anywhere near the volume of infrasound that could actually make that happen. And two, most people's impression of where this is coming from is based on this video that seems to basically be built on stilts. These like don't actually say what the presenter is saying they say at all. It's like really overwhelming if you watch the video. There are like literally 30 studies that he completely mangles and misrepresents, and it's like very overwhelming. So I'd recommend people just read my post on that for more details. But like audible noise pollution, I take very seriously, and there are like specific things you can do about it, but like you shouldn't be totally trustful that data centers will behave well there. But then separately, infrasound, I think is basically just a non-issue. And like, I really worry that this is really warping the debate based on like this video that just really misrepresented.
I'm sure that most people don't distinguish between the two, which is what that YouTube that you're mentioning relies on. Plus the fact that I'm not sure how many people bother to follow through links. You know, they see a YouTube video that has high production values, and they assume that the quality of the data and the commentary matches the quality of the production values, and they don't dig further to discover whether or not that's an accurate representation of the thesis that's being articulated. So I can see that that's a problem. Maybe it's really just a question of the governance catching up and better regulating of where these data centers are sited. You know, maybe don't allow them to site next to a residential community, you know, less than a quarter of a mile away or something like that. Whatever the relevant distance away is to protect people from the effects that you mentioned. Again, going to Texas, which is, you know, something I'm very aware of because I'm working on a project there. You know, there are vast areas of Texas that just don't have any residential community within a relevant distance of a data center. You know, what better use could you have for, you know, West Texas than citing energy resources there, citing data centers there? You know, you don't have to worry about getting all of that renewable energy that is generating out in West Texas across a grid that's inadequate to transport it at the moment. You can just connect it locally and have that territory used up with, you know, generation and consumption. So it's a, you know, and maybe that's why there are over 700 data centers that are currently trying to connect in ERCOT, right? Because it's an appropriate place to site rather than some of the more densely populated areas of, you know, of PJM. Not that all of PJM is, you know, is densely populated. Certainly, I think Loudoun County probably is pretty densely populated. But, you know, compared to, you know, ERCOT, that sort of density is potentially raising much more serious issues when it comes to, you know, land use, water use, you know, all of the difficult to pass issues of who is paying for what and how the cost should be appropriately socialized, and how you socialize the cost of a 100-mile 765 kV cable that's being put in to service, among other things, large data center footprints. So, siting maybe is an issue that needs to be better studied during the zoning process, if there is a zoning process, which in some cases there just isn't, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, a ton of stuff to say on this in general, but yeah, I think in general, just so much of the noise issue is fixed by just offsetting data centers from where people live. Like there are very simple like physics power laws or just like laws in general governing like roughly, what the volume will be of sound, like a certain distance away from where the data center is. And there's like some complicating factors of like, oh, if it's lower frequency, it can travel a little bit farther. And like these are definitely problems, but there's just like so much wide open space in a lot of America specifically. And so like if you're not super worried about like a data center being built in the middle of nowhere that might have otherwise had like a farm, but like we just have a lot of space for farms as well. Like there, I think like is just a pretty promising space for data centers, with the caveat that a lot of people will get upset that there's this massive new building that is just changing the character of like what you see when you look out at like these great vistas that exist in a lot of the country.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting looking at the, in terms of relative footprints for a 1 gigawatt data center. If you were to serve that with a solar array, for example, you would need probably, I think I looked into this, about 4 times the amount of the data center footprint in terms of a solar array to generate enough energy. Plus, you would need a whole lot of batteries together with that, because you need to overbuild the solar in order to capture enough of the available sun, the daylight that the solar array can capture, and then store in the batteries and then power the data center during the times when the sun isn't shining. When you start thinking in relative terms about the sort of footprint of the renewable resources that will be needed to feed behind the meter data centers, it's kind of an interesting proposition. And then you get into, should we be encouraging the use of gas turbines? And G Vernova is booked up considerably in advance to supply those. So then you look at Bloom Energy and people like that and say, what are they? How can they solve that? And how long of a solution is that? How long-term of a solution is that? I think the impatience of the data center operators to get energized quickly is definitely understandable. I think it definitely exceeds the capacity of the grid to get built out quickly enough to serve all of that load that would like to come online. And thinking through, how long is it that the chips that they're paying, the GPUs that they're paying a ton of money for, how long is that depreciation period, and do they actually buy those chips and have them depreciated fully before they get them connected up to power? I mean, there are some examples of that, which is a tough proposition. And I see a lot of podcasts and commentators think about what is the return on investment for the hyperscalers and all the capital that they're committing to the space. How are we measuring that? How does that reflect on the stock prices? Are we using sufficient number of tools to calculate what the benefits are, and so on? So it's a challenging area. I mean, I know you write a lot about this. I write. I mean, this is being hosted on a site called the AI Grid Report. Plug for that while we're at it. It's what I spend a lot of time looking at. Across all of the different RTOs in the country, PGM, MISO, CAISO, ERCOT, and it's a challenging and very physically constrained space to actually sort through to get all of this load connected up. I mean, we can measure because it's very public, the length of interconnection queues on the generation side, but on the load side, it's much harder to get your hands around that. I mean, ERCOT, for example, does publish. It's as an RTO, it is incredibly diligent about publishing information on its website. So you can know that even though Texas has peaked at, I think, 83 or 85 gigawatts of usage back in 24, the amount of load aspiring to connect at the moment is over 400 gigawatts, which is a staggering, multiple of the amount that has ever been used in the past. So when you think about that in grid terms and how much has to be built and who is going to build that, that's a sizable problem to address.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I don't have like too much specific takes on like the very specifics of like interconnect queues and things like that. I think I'm very far from it. Like I consider myself very far from an expert on that, but yeah, just the numbers involved are really unbelievable. Like, I like made my name talking a lot about like AI and water stuff, but like, I have to say like, well, I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that like the environmental movement should, shut down like data centers for the sake of the environment. Like the numbers, I can see why people are really freaking out. Like the numbers here are really eye-popping, like even just like in Northern Virginia, I think the statistic is something like we have like, 5 gigawatts going to data centers, which like I might be wrong, that's something like 1% of the power draw of the entire country. And then like Kevin O'Leary's proposed data center would be 9 gigawatts. I think like just the idea of like individual facilities using whole gigawatts of power is just like a new thing. And, like if I could go back in time to my college self and tell them like, oh yeah, there's this new industry that is fully electrified already. I think he would be pretty excited that like, oh, like this is in some ways really ideal for the green energy transition. Because like if the new major industry in America is already fully electrified, we don't have to do any of the really complicating engineering tasks of electrifying something that relies a lot on like primary fuels. But at the same time, like, yeah, it's just such an unbelievable amount of energy that I don't see data centers being met with, like fully green power anytime in the short term anyway. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, I think like my main ask here for people looking at this is to judge data centers from the perspective of how much total energy they use rather than electricity, just because they use a huge amount of our electricity, obviously. But ultimately, like in our green energy utopia, we would eventually like most industries like primary like use of energy to be via electricity in one way or another. Like electric cars are going to use a huge amount of electricity as well. And like, I think that instead of saying, oh, they like data centers use such a huge proportion of our current grid, it's important also just to ask what is the future grid that we want, and like kind of judge that we're not pushing things for already being electrified, which we really need to happen for the green energy transition.
Yeah, there's a great expression that I heard this morning on another podcast by actually a friend of mine, but he's well known for writing or co-authoring the book for economics, Stephen Dubner. He's started this new series, in-person discussions, and he had this discussion. The first discussion was with a starchitect called Bjerg Ingels, and he loves to speak in oxymorons, and he used this term pragmatic utopia, which on the face of it is an oxymoron, but the that's sort of the challenge that architecture faces. It embeds a creative vision into the real world and has to deal with real world constraints. And in building out our grid in America, we have precisely that issue, right? We have a utopia which may satisfy a lot of the renewable energy proponents who don't necessarily embrace the fact that an energy mix may be the right way to think about how we fuel our energy consumption, and the pragmatic approach to that is yes, but as a transitional measure, you may need to use gas turbines, you may need to use let's say fuel cells, you may even need to tap into some more traditional fossil fuel resources to build the bridge power to something that you might find more acceptable. So these are kind of challenges that exist and can't be ignored, and you kind of ignore them at the peril of achieving the objective that everybody agrees on, right? So it's like, yes, we all want to be able to, flip open our laptop, turn on Claude, do research for an article, whatever it is that we're doing with that, and have that be an easy process to go through. And yet we don't necessarily think through to what that means in terms of how we power the data centers that actually allow us to do that. It's like when you drive across America and realize how huge it is. And we recently drove down from Idaho to Colorado, and you see all of these electric transmission lines going across the country, and you take a picture of them. You ask, "What is that? Is that a 765? Is it a 500 kV? Is it a 230 kV? And how much is that sort of transporting?" And then you look at it and you say, okay, it's a 230 kV line, and it's connected to this coal plant on the Wyoming border, the Jim Bridger coal plant. He's like, oh, okay, how is that bringing the power generation to the destination, and what is that being used for? So it's only when you start getting out there and outside of the big city that you may live in that you see what kind of infrastructure is delivering the everyday lives that we live, mostly unconscious of what the sort of real world consequences of all that is. So, I think people are just going to have to wrestle with a lot of these things if they want to continue to have the nice things that they rely on every day. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot to say about that. I think like one of the great privileges of like talking about data centers a lot is getting to go on these deep dives of like just how the infrastructure in America works, because it is overwhelming and unbelievable. Like I have to say that I do worry that a lot of people in the debate will often just get these kind of blinders on, where they're just like kind of considering like the world is their home, the place that they work, and these new weird things called data centers that you have to trade off. And like, I don't know, like I actually recently like made the drive up from like DC to Massachusetts to visit my family and some friends. And like just the entire time, I'm just very aware of like, there's there's an unbelievable amount of like industry along the way. There are all these other really massive buildings. There's, like Amazon fulfillment centers and like all these other things. And this is in a very built up part of the country. And I do worry that a lot of people just don't spend enough time just like looking out the window and thinking about just how complicated and sometimes like how messy it is to provide all the other things that we need in our society. Like I think with like land use stuff and data centers, a part of me just wants to be like look out the window in the plane more, just like observe just like how like sometimes strange and mysterious the ways that America use land are, and like how many industries even in your area you just might not. Like I think for a lot of industries and part of their like people did through, like Wyoming and saw the coal plant that you saw, or they saw a lot of other just industry operating normally. I don't think that other industry would survive this level of scrutiny either, not necessarily because it's bad, but just because it comes with real trade-offs, both in terms of like its emissions or its ugliness, or like other things like that. Like, I don't know, like being from central Massachusetts, like I consider myself to be from kind of like one of the uglier parts of the country. I'm just around a lot of like old decaying factories and stuff. And I think that like, yeah, I don't know, driving around Loudoun County in comparison and just being like, there's effectively what looks like a really large mall over there, like among the trees. Like I'm kind of overwhelmed that this is what everybody is so fixated on. Like I would kind of like politely ask people to, like maybe, just poke around Google Maps a little bit, or like Google Earth, and just like see like what the infrastructure serving us in every other context physically looks like. And then ask like, like America is not only hosting all this new AI infrastructure for us, but it's also hosting a lot of AI infrastructure for the rest of the world as well. Like I think only like 15% of users of ChatGPT live in America, but like something like 75% of all the advanced AI chips in the world are here specifically. And so like not only is this industry that's popping up, like, being disproportionately disproportionately hosted in America, it's like not being disproportionately used by Americans. And so we're seeing the industrial results of this big global new thing. And like, if this is what it's at so far, like, I don't know, this doesn't seem super shocking to me so far. It's like, yeah, there's this new lucrative industry. It's using a certain amount of land, a certain amount of water, a really significant amount of our electricity. But like, besides that, I think that just like having the full context of like the really honestly exciting and wild ways that American industry and infrastructure and energy works is just pretty cool to have as a perspective.
Yeah. It's easy to go on a rant about this, and I definitely don't want to do that. But the one thing to be aware of, since you mentioned America versus the rest of the world, is that China, for example, has built more grid infrastructure in the last 5 years than we actually have at all. I mean, they've built in excess of, I think 1.2, 1.4 terawatts, and they're building, high voltage DC lines. They don't have to deal with the distributed democratic process of input that we have in America, which is good and bad. But for them, in terms of building the infrastructure, it's clearly makes it a lot easier. And their models are beginning to approach a point where they're better than 90% as good as some of the large language models that we're more familiar with here. So there are other parts of the world that are putting themselves in the position to actually benefit and host some of that capability. We have a question here from Connor that says, can you speak to the long-term benefits of having data center dollars to pay for FOAK energy development and deployment, and how much spillover benefit will someone who doesn't use compute see in the long run? Maybe unpack, first of all, what does FOAK mean? You may know that. It's not a term that I'm familiar with.
I have to admit I'm tripping over this as well. I'm kind of like someone who knows a little about a lot with data centers, and I'm worried Connor's poking the hole in my like surface of understanding. So Connor, do you want to clarify that for us? I think that like the main question about data centers that I'd really like to know, that I just don't feel like I have a clear answer to, and I try not to speak too much, is how positive sum versus, oh, thank you. I think maybe the most interesting question about the environmental impacts of data centers is something that I haven't really been able to answer yet, either for myself or for other people at all, which is how zero sum versus positive sum they are for the green energy transition specifically. So like when a data center comes to town, like the hyperscalers have paid a huge amount in like power purchasing agreements for new renewable energy. And there have been a lot of places where they've successfully internalized the cost of building like high energy transmission lines, which we really need, and things like that. But for currently existing technology, like I don't really have a great sense of like, oh, this is leading to all these spillover effects in, the grid build out in general, and it's really positive, versus like, oh, this is like the data centers are kind of hogging the green energy that would have existed for other things anyway, like for them, and like it adds up to nothing. Or maybe it's even negative because they're building out new fossil fuel infrastructure that is just like more costly to take down and replace with renewable. So I really wish I had a better answer to that, but I like every time I start to approach this question, just like the flood of different like questions about like, the economics of new, or just like how the grid works, which is still like, despite having read about it for years, it's still a deep mystery to me. Like there's so much about like energy economics that I just don't feel like I understand personally. And like, especially like first of a kind energy development, like I'm yet very far from an expert in, and like, there's a lot of cool investment happening in like new technology as well. Like, modular nuclear reactors are really cool, but I just feel so far from an expert on this that I'd kind of have to punt on it. Like would be curious, like if you have any thoughts specifically as someone who thinks about this stuff more.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time listening to, there's a podcast out there that's very helpful called Catalyst. It's run by Shal Khan. And he discusses a lot of the leading edge technologies that are coming along, like seeding the atmosphere with particles that can assist in absorbing some of the heating that is otherwise affecting the sort of the heat signature of that we're generating sort of anthrogenically. And there are technologies that are being developed to make the energy generation puzzle a little easier to solve. I'm not convinced that generating out in space or putting data centers out in space, as cool as that looks, the idea of having a satellite that, that leaves the atmosphere and then unfolds into this multi-acre data center, fine. I think we're ways from that. I'm not even sure how that works in terms of efficiency, but first of a kind is definitely something that we need to be aware of, because it can untangle some of the the problems that we have a tendency to sort of project out based on the situation that we're in, and make assumptions about where this will all end if it continues on the path that we are on at the moment. And the history tends to inform us that the path that we're on changes, right? So in order to be able to evaluate what that change adds up to, we have to be able to predict something that is inherently hard to predict, which is a change of path. And so that's sort of the challenge of first of a kind, and calculating the benefits of something that you can't actually know at the moment is very hard to do. You know that it probably will happen, but exactly how that unfolds is tough to estimate. So I think ironically, one of the tools that we have available to us to measure and figure all that out and to demystify some of these mysteries is the large language models that allow us to access the best and widest available human knowledge on the subject that we are investigating. And so that's incredibly valuable. You have to develop the skills to be able to pass through that in an intelligent way and sort through all of the lesser quality information that's out there. But we have never had as many tools as we have now to research and demystify some of the problems that plague the areas that we're thinking about right now. So it is an enormously valuable tool. Now, I know that we could probably go on for a while, and I didn't advertise that we would go for beyond sort of 30 to 45 minutes. So I'm conscious that we're bumping up against that limit at the moment. So I don't want to keep you for much longer, but I do want to allow you to give people a sense of where they might go. If that, I know you subscribe to my publication, the AI Grid Report. You have your own Substack. You're out there on X. You're out there on LinkedIn. What's the best way for people to access the content that you generate on a regular basis?
Yeah, and I'm definitely super flexible on time, so this is great. Yeah, really enjoying it. I think that, definitely subscribing to my Substack is the way to go. I also have a personal website, just andymasley.com, where I host all my stuff and also link to other things that I'm doing. So if you want to hear me on like podcasts or see like visuals that I'll make, like I've been really into vibe coding, like pretty simple visuals of like, hey, here's how, your AI usage compares to like every other part of your day in terms of its environmental footprint, or, like other things I'm interested in, like here's how many chickens are in factory farms and things like that. So everything there is just on andymasley.com. And you can also just find me on Substack. My loyal subscribers, I'm always very grateful for, and like subscribers in general are very useful to me, so would be very grateful if you subscribed. And yeah, I think like for other information on data centers, like one really great source, like I'd usually point people as a place to start, is the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs General Report on data centers. I think that's probably just the single most comprehensive study that's been done on them so far, and I'm hoping for some updates soon. They recently published an update on their energy estimates from the report, where it seems like they basically based a lot of their understanding on, hey, the last year that we have really good numbers for this is in 2023, so we'll start there and then just project forward based on what we understand about like the spending that we project will be for data centers. And so far it's mostly held up. Like the actual amount of energy being used on data centers is shockingly within like the exact middle of the range that they had forecast. And so like other things like their water forecasts into 2028 also turn out to be pretty reliable. And so like they're kind of my go-to as the place to start.
Okay. No, it's a great resource. And just for people here who are not familiar with my Substack, it's the AIGridReport.com. And it doesn't spend all its time on data centers. Its focus is to examine all of the issues that relate to the interrelationship of AI with the physical grid that delivers it to its consumers. So, I produce on a weekly basis. heat maps that analyze across all of the territories, how they're doing in terms of supplying generation, consuming load, the regulatory framework that that is is in the background of all of that. So for anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into that, I definitely invite you to go there. I do. That's not all my time. I spend a lot of time through my business, Dakota Ridge Capital, focusing on providing advisory services to clean energy developers trying to get their projects built. One of those projects at the moment is a data center in ERCOT. So if anybody's interested in that, feel free to reach out to me and we can chat some more. Andy, it's been great to chat with you. I'm sure we'll do this again because it's been so much fun and there's so much to say. So thank you very much, and I will speak to you again soon.
Yeah, this was really great. High honor. Yeah, big fan of your Substack in general. So obviously, like, everyone should subscribe there as well. But yeah, really appreciated this. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for joining.
Okay, everybody else, thank you for joining and listening.